Thank you for that reaction. You're watching The Context on BBC News. The UN Security Council has failed to pass a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in the Israel-Gaza war after the United States vetoed the resolution. 13 countries voted in favour. The UK abstained. This is the moment it was announced.
En contra.
Against.
At the opening of the debate, Mr. Gutierrez condemned Hamas and the brutality of the October 7th attack. But that, he said, did not absolve Israel of its obligations under international law to protect civilians.
While indiscriminate rockets fired by Hamas into Israel and the use of civilians as human shields are in contravention with the laws of war, such conduct does not absolve Israel on its own violations. International humanitarian law includes the duty to protect civilians and to comply with the principles of distinction, proportionality and precaution.
Although the US vetoed the vote, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says there is a gap between Israel's promise to protect civilians and its actions on the ground. More than 17,000 Palestinians have now been killed, according to the Hamas-run Health Ministry. And while Israel claims that some 5,000 of that number are Hamas fighters, there are huge numbers of women and children among the dead. Frank Lowenstein, who was formerly President Obama's special envoy for Middle East peace, says the numbers are concerning, but he told me why the United States was expected not to vote in favour of the ceasefire.
Well, because in the minds of the United States and the Biden administration, there's two very different questions here. The first is, should there be a ceasefire that effectively allows Hamas to stay in place? And we've been very clear that we oppose that. At the same time, we really have been pushing the Israelis as hard as we can to get them to allow more humanitarian assistance and to do more to prevent civilian casualties. And I think that's where the United States is going to be under increasing pressure domestically, politically at home and internationally to start putting tougher measures in place to ensure that Israel actually does comply with humanitarian law.
Let's pick this up with our panel. Joining us tonight, the former advisor to the Treasury here in the UK, Leon Emirali, now a PR consultant, and the Democratic and legal analyst, Kelly Hyman. Welcome to you both, and thank you for your patience as we took that vote in. Kelly, let me start with you. Pick up that point that Frank Lowenstein was making there, the political pressure that is now building on Joe Biden. What will this vote mean domestically for him?
I think it's important to remember, first of all, that we are one nation, we are all together, and that the United States supports Israel. But we have to think about this globally and the effects of what's going to happen in the future. And hopefully there can be some type of resolution that's going to help the people of Israel and be beneficial to everyone.
Does it in any way... I mean, the point that Robert Wood was making in his address to the Council just now is that all the US recommendations were ignored, that it was rushed, there wasn't the appropriate consultation. Is that really the answer? Or do you think from the get-go here, the United States wanted to give Israel more time?
I think the United States wanted to give Israel more time. I definitely think that's important, and hopefully there can be some type of resolution to do this. It's horrific what happened to the people of Israel and to lose their loved ones in the situation they did. But everyone wants peace. Everyone wants some type of resolution. And so hopefully that will be forthcoming for all of us.
Leon, we heard from the United Arab Emirates who had sponsored this resolution, had brought this resolution before the Council, and he questioned what the purpose of the United Nations Security Council is. There'll be a lot of people tonight looking at what's happening in Gaza wondering the same, won't they?
I think there will be, Christian. I think that this is a disappointing evening for a lot of people who do want to see peace in this conflict. I mean, when we look at the scenes around the United Nations table, the international diplomacy that's going on is far removed from the situation on the ground in Gaza, also in Israel, where the fighting is taking place. And I think for those individuals, they will be absolutely distraught. I imagine that the sign of a ceasefire, the chances of a ceasefire, are diminished. And I think I'm disappointed, I have to say, in the US and the UK for not taking this as an opportunity to signal their dedication towards finding a peaceful resolution.
What do you make about the European position? So I'm just looking at the comments from the French representative, who says we do not see any contradiction in the fight against terrorism and the protection of civilians in strict respect for international humanitarian law. They expressed grave concern about what was going on. And then they added, unfortunately, once again, this council has failed with a lack of unity and by refusing to genuinely commit to negotiations. Why do you think the UK didn't vote against the resolution and abstained?
Well, I think the UK is in a very difficult situation because obviously the alliance with the United States is incredibly important from a military diplomacy point of view, but also the relationship with our European allies is incredibly important. So the UK, in a way, was stuck in between a rock and a hard place. And I think by abstaining, they essentially took an easy way out of being able to say that we support what the US is ultimately saying, and that they wish there was more of a considered approach to the negotiation terms for this ceasefire, whilst also recognising there are a lot of people in Europe, as well as in the UK, who do want to see a ceasefire implemented. And I think for the UK to take that position has ultimately shown that they are trying to now straddle the best of both worlds and not alienating any allies on either side of where they are at the moment.
Plenty of live reaction on the live page on the BBC website if you want to follow some of the comments from the UN Security Council. But let's move on. Before we were turning to that vote, I was telling you about the situation in Ukraine, where Russia has fired cruise missiles for the first time in over 2 months. The air raid in Kyiv lasted almost 2 hours. Thankfully, all the missiles heading towards the Ukrainian capital were destroyed by Western-supplied air defences. The central parts of the country, though, not so lucky. 1 person was killed, 4 others were injured in the city of Pavlograd. 6 S-300s, those are the long-range surface-to-air missiles, were fired at eastern Kharkiv region, with residential buildings destroyed, 1 dead, several others injured. Coincidence? Not likely. The Russians are probably taking their cue from what is going on in the United States right now. Ukraine desperately needs support. Congress still deadlocked on that crucial funding bill. The Republicans refusing to budge unless and until Joe Biden agrees to immigration reform. The Kremlin is coming again, determined to impress on Western capitals that it has the stamina and the means to continue this fight. Let's bring in Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, former Director of European Affairs for the United States National Security Council. Thank you for coming on the programme. Thank you for your patience waiting for us while we got through everything at the Security Council tonight. Your reaction to what has happened today in Ukraine vis-a-vis what is happening in the United States?
Unfortunately, it's expected that Russia was going to attempt to punish the Ukrainian capital, target Ukrainian infrastructure, degrade the energy infrastructure, and make it a particularly cold and harsh winter. As you pointed out, it is not coincidental that the Russians are looking to punctuate the fact that the U.S. House of Representatives, Senate, Republicans in general are obstructing critical aid to Ukraine by signaling that there'll be continued Russian aggression. I think that this has been part of Russia's plan all along, to wait and allow natural fault lines to emerge and then exploit those. And it's pretty shocking that in the same breath that that you see these cruise missile strikes on Ukraine, you see accolades and praise for their Republican obstruction of the Ukraine aid. So as you pointed out, it's not coincidental. We'll see more of this unfold. It is absolutely critical. It is essential that the U.S. finally provide aid to Ukraine. Otherwise, even the status quo, this kind of limited gains, limiting the gains of the Russians, successful defenses by the Ukrainians, that's likely to unravel.
Mr. Putin's press spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, said today the idea Russia would engage in peace talks with Ukraine on Kyiv's terms next year was unrealistic. He was responding there to reports in Washington that the White House is pushing behind the scenes for a negotiated settlement. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm doubtful. I engaged with the U.S. government. I just had a briefing with 2 senior State Department officials yesterday. I'm very doubtful that there are any real pushes towards Ukraine negotiating on any. The reason for that is simple: is that there is no indication that the Russians are ready to negotiate, and having the Ukrainians engage in negotiations would be a fruitless endeavor. I think their expectation now is clear and hardened that war is going to continue through 2024. One of the milestones will be the presidential election. If Joe Biden retains the White House, which in my view is likely, then there will be a little bit more of a seriousness from the Russian side to negotiate on the prospects of 4 more years of war. However, if Trump were to win the White House, then that would be an opportunity that the Russians would seize to go for their maximalist objectives. But I don't think there's a real prospect of any meaningful peace negotiations between now and then. If anything, it would be closer to capitulation that the Russians would be looking for from the Ukrainians.
Colonel Vindman, stay with us because I want you to comment on this other big news today from Moscow. Vladimir Putin announcing that he will be running again in Russia's presidential elections next year, as had been widely expected. But the announcement came about in a rather roundabout way via a question posed by a senior officer at a ceremony honouring heroes of the fatherland. The president's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, insisted it was all spontaneous. I'll let you decide.
I, on behalf of all our people, all of Donbass, our joined lands, would like to ask you to take part in these elections.
Thank you very much. I will not hide the fact that at different times I had different thoughts. Now you are right. This is the time. The decision needs to be made. I will run for the post of President of the Russian Federation.
Kelly, the last time, or the first time that Vladimir Putin was elected, Bill Clinton was still in power. This term, and you would imagine he would win it, would take him all the way to 2036. He would almost be the longest-serving Russian leader after Stalin. But I suppose that depends on whether or not he wins this war.
So this term actually would take him to 2030. Then he would run again in a surprise. Yeah, he would run again in another surprise bid after lots of deliberation to 2036. So I think we could go ahead and predict the fact that he would probably stay through 2036. Those would be his last 2 terms. But I mean, of course, everything is choreographed and staged. There is no surprise that he was going to run for another election. I think for me, what I think about the election in March is I think it might be a turning point actually in the Russia-Ukraine war, that with another 6 years basically secured, probably some machinations, high turnout, high popular results for Putin, we could see another mass mobilization. But no, of course, it's no surprise that he's running for office. I think what the implications of that might be for the next 6 years of Russia-Ukraine relations and Russia relations with the West, those are probably the more significant factors, with probably a fair number of surprises emerging over that period of time.
Kelly Hyman, does that change the politics in Washington, people knowing that he's going to be there for the duration?
I think it's going to depend on who is the next president of the United States when the election comes up. I think that's going to be key on how it's going to affect whether Biden's going to win a re-election, or if Trump, who's most likely going to be the nominee, going to win, because that's definitely going to have an effect on the relationship with Russia. But there is no surprise here that he was going to run. And I agree with the other speaker, the fact that it looked as though it was pre-planned that he was going to run and announce it this way.
Leon, this news that he is going to run again sort of coincides with some worrying news that's come out of Russia today, that Navalny, Alexei Navalny, has gone missing. He was supposed to appear in court. That didn't happen. He's not been seen by his lawyer for 3 days. They're talking about a blackout at the maximum security prison where he is. But we know he's already been quite ill before this, and now has dropped off the face of the earth at a time when Putin is saying he will run again. I don't know if that's a coincidence or not, but it will certainly worry his supporters.
I think it will worry his supporters, and I think it also shines a light that, OK, we're talking about the terms of Vladimir Putin running for re-election, but let's face it, it's not going to be much of an election. I think there is going to be a lot of scrutiny about the actual democratic process that takes place in the Russian presidential election, and the fact that Navalny is worryingly missing, we don't seem to know where he is, just shows you the brutality of Vladimir Putin, that he is willing to not engage with his political opponents, but actually to lock them up and potentially harm them. So I think that just shows you the deficit of democracy in Russia and what we can expect if he does retain that presidency for that period of time. And I do think that Vladimir Putin, he may stage these types of choreographed moments where it looks as though the Russian people are supporting him. But I think in reality, the war in Ukraine is not as popular as he would like it to be. There are hundreds of thousands of Russian lives being lost, and I think that will play a part in his popularity back home, even if he is able to keep hold of his place in the Kremlin. Yeah, it's a very good point. Colonel Vindman, before I let you go, we're all going to talk after the break about migration and what the Republicans are pushing in the House. Just on Joe Biden, who's been accused in the past of giving Ukraine just enough but not enough to win, do you think at this moment, with money running out, he needs to do more from the White House? Is it time that he called the congressional leaders, brought everyone together, found a way through this?
Absolutely, the Biden administration has to do more. What I'm concerned about is even when we pass this Ukraine appropriation in the next couple of weeks, I think that there's a better than even chance that it happens. That's still not going to be enough. It's going to be hard for the Biden administration to sustain the level of support provided in 2023 based on what was already given and what remains in the stocks. And I think we haven't invested enough in our defense infrastructure to be able to increase to the level that Ukraine needs. I think 2024 is going to be challenging. The Russians are likely to mobilize. The Ukrainians are running low on ammunition. The Russians are actually starting to gain some additional drones. They're increasing their production of munitions. Continuing on at the level that was provided in 2023 is not going to be enough. The Ukrainians need training, they need munitions, they need material, they need logistics, and that's what this administration needs to do to have any chance of having Ukraine have a successful 2024 and set conditions for a more favorable negotiation.
Yeah. As Lord Ricketts said on this programme last night, we are on a war footing whether we like it or not, and it is incumbent on governments to respond in that way. Colonel Vindman, always good to talk to you. Thank you very much. Stay with us. You're watching BBC News. Let's take a quick look at some of the other stories making news here in the UK today. The funeral of Pogues frontman Shane MacGowan has been held in County Tipperary in Ireland. Stars including Bono, Johnny Depp took part in the funeral mass, with hundreds of mourners gathering in the grounds of the church in Nina. The fairy tale of New York singer died on the 30th of November at the age of 65. Judges have ruled the UK government acted lawfully in blocking Scotland's gender self-ID reforms. Legislation making it easier for people to change their legally recognised sex was passed by the Scottish Parliament last year, but the UK government blocked it over fears it would impact equality laws. The Scottish government legal challenge to that veto has now been rejected. Yellow weather warnings for wind and rain are in place for large parts of the UK tonight and into Saturday, with disruption likely over the weekend. The Met Office says severe weather is expected in western and central England, as well as Wales, southwest Scotland and Northern Ireland. There are 30 flood warnings in place where flooding is expected. You're watching BBC News. We start on immigration. Rishi Sunak told reporters that his revamped Rwanda plan will save British taxpayers money by ending the costly expense of housing illegal migrants in hotels. But an investigation into the terms of his renegotiated deal reveals that on top of the £140 million Britain has already handed over to Rwanda, they will get an extra £100 million this year and a further £50 million next year. The scheme to send some asylum seekers to Rwanda for processing and potential resettlement in order to deter those crossing the English Channel has until now been wrapped up in legal challenges, one after another. So far, no one has been sent to Rwanda. So is it value for money? The new Minister of State for Legal Migration and Delivery, Tom Pursglove, says yes, it is.
What we want to bring about is ensuring that the policy is robust, that the capacity is in place to operationalise this as quickly as possible, and that is what some of this money is there to do. Set that in the context of that £8 million a day spend that is currently going on. The Rwanda policy is a key part of our answer to getting those costs down, to saving lives.
Prime Minister says the bill, which he will put before the House on Tuesday, will stop most legal challenges and satisfy the British public. He was hoping this policy would give the Conservatives a pre-election bounce. The latest YouGov poll out today shows that's not materialised. Instead, it's split his party. The right says the bill does not go far enough. The One Nation Tories to the centre say declaring in law that Rwanda is safe is rather like declaring all dogs are cats. Here's the former Chancellor, George Osborne.
The Tory civil wars have completely reopened. You know, Rishi Sunak's big claim was, I've come after the chaos of Boris Johnson and the chaos of Liz Truss. He can't now claim anymore to have stabilised things. You know, his government is fragmenting around this immigration issue.
So Leon, the former number 10 advisor, Dominic Cummings, who is, let's face it, never shy to share his opinion, said the Prime Minister is pretending that he's blocking the courts when he very obviously is not. There will be a useless attempt, he says, to claim that the bill has been sabotaged by the Lords and the courts and that this is what the election is about. Is he right?
Well, I think some of that is right, Christian, if not all of it. I think that this is a flawed policy from the very beginning. You know, it seems to be that it's incredibly costly, isn't viable, and therefore isn't achieving the ultimate objectives that it's intended to. And I think the biggest political problem for Rishi Sunak about this policy, as you mentioned, is that it doesn't please any faction of his party. And that is a real problem for Rishi Sunak because he's scratching around wondering who this policy does speak to. And it's well worth remembering this wasn't Rishi Sunak's policy. This wasn't Liz Truss's policy. This was Boris Johnson's policy. And there's obviously been a lot of change in government since he was Prime Minister and since this policy was announced. And it seems as though Rishi Sunak, one way or the other, is going to be defined by the Rwanda policy, which is slightly strange because it isn't something that he necessarily supports. But clearly, immigration is going to be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, issue at the next UK general election. And if the Conservatives look like they can't make it work, I think it's a big problem for them.
Do you agree with George Osborne that the party's fragmenting at just the worst possible moment?
I think the party's been fragmented since 2016, really, Christian. I think since the Brexit debate, it's opened this chasm in the Conservative Party. And really, you cannot win an election if you are as divided as the Conservatives currently are. And I think the reality of it is that, yes, the Conservative Party is a broad church, and you'll hear that a lot from people within the party. But is it too broad? Is there too many spectrums on the political spectrum that we are trying to appease? And ultimately, you can't please everyone. And I think this is what Rishi Sunak is finding out. And you're going into the next election looking like you're divided, looking like you haven't got a plan, while the Labour Party look on and rub their hands in glee, I'm sure.
Well, the US equivalent of the English Channel is the southern border with Mexico, although the figures involved are nowhere near comparable. 12,000 migrants crossed into the United States on Tuesday alone. September was the busiest month ever for the border force, 260,000 encounters. In Congress, that similar clamour for immigration reform is now holding up the supplementary aid for Ukraine, as we've just discussed. So, Kelly, the Republicans, whatever you think about their policy on Ukraine, the Republicans are right about the border. The Biden administration's strategy to keep asylum seekers from flocking to the United States, it's just not working. And most of these people are not fleeing persecution. They're not in fear of life or limb. So do we need to restore asylum to its purpose as a route to safety for those who fear for their lives?
Every country should protect their borders. But as you talked about, asylum, absolutely. And that's what the court of systems is set up, the court of law, to deal with that as well. But really, these are two separate issues when we're talking about the aid to Ukraine and then also with immigration reform. Biden has said, went to Congress and said there should be immigration reform, but they are not acting. They are not proceeding to do it. And Biden is doing what he can with the limited power that he has to secure the borders, but do also in a humane way as well. But ultimately, it's going to be up to Congress to implement reform, and hopefully they will do that and also pass the funding for Ukraine, because these are not two same issues. These are two separate issues.
I mean, as you say, it sort of comes down in one sense to deterrence. Most reasonable people, I think, would think it's not okay to separate children from their families and put them in cages, as was the policy at one point of the Trump administration. So what is the best form of deterrent when many who are expelled only return and have another go?
One way to do it is to help fund the countries that they're coming to, so that they are not dealing with such economic issues, but also that people are seeking asylum and that they have the rights that they're allowed to have once they come. The United States is made up of immigrants. That's what makes the country so great, the fact that diversity is there, and diversity is what makes it great. But ultimately, it'll be up to Congress to implement some type of immigration reform that is going to work going forward.
Yeah, the one comparison, and we'll get Leon's view on this in a second, is the backlog. I mean, 2.2 million is the backlog in the United States. That final determination that has to be made could take years and years. And that's not a process that deters illegal migrants, is it? Quite the opposite. Kelly.
Oh.
Sorry.
We have to think of this of yes, every country is allowed to protect their borders, and they have a right to do that as well. But there needs to be reform, and the way that is done in the United States is by Congress to act. And Biden administration has stated that they should be immigration reform, but yet Congress is not acting on it. And I think that's key. I think that's important to do and important to realize that the Congress needs to act in the U.S.
What about here, Leon? I mean, that's the big problem which the minister put his finger on today. We're spending £8 million every day on housing people in hotels. The quickest way to get rid of that bill is to process people, isn't it?
Yeah, well, you'd certainly think so. And I think the argument that's being made in Westminster at the moment is that by sending illegal immigrants who come to this country seeking asylum, sending them to a safe third country is a way of making it cheaper for dealing with those people who arrive in the UK. But the reality, Christian, as we've seen from a Home Office report today, is that actually it's potentially £60,000 or so more expensive to send people to a third country. And actually, it's better off keeping them here in the UK and processing them in this country. So the reality is very different from what we're hearing, I think, on the airways from certain politicians. And that has to make a great deal of sense to people, because ultimately what we're looking for is value for money for the taxpayer. And if we can't get that with this policy, then I'm not entirely sure why we're even proceeding with it.
And Leon should know, because he was an advisor to the Treasury, so he knows where the numbers are. Listen, we're going to take a short break. We'll be straight back. We're going to talk about Hunter Biden and also COP28 and some surprising poll numbers about the attitude of the Americans. Stay with us.
Hello there. We've got a couple of areas of low pressure for this weekend. That will bring spells of mild but also wet weather at times. It'll be noticeably mild compared to what we had last weekend. There will be some sunshine around over the weekend. It's not going to be a complete washout, and it's going to be windy both days, but particularly late on Saturday. This is Saturday's low pressure system hurtling through, bringing band of rain, squeezing the isobars, bringing those gales, and then Sunday's low pressure moves through. Not quite as windy on Sunday, but still another band of rainfall. What you will notice, both by day and by night, it's going to be very mild for the time of year. Now, with more rain falling on already saturated ground, we've already got a number of flood warnings. This is going to exacerbate the issue, and we could see more flood warnings by the end of the weekend. So stay tuned to the forecast. Head online if you have any concerns. Through tonight, it stays very wet. Central, southern Scotland, windy for the Northern Isles. And then here comes the next batch of wet and windy weather pushing into Northern Ireland, Wales, the Midlands, southern and southwest England. Very mild with it, but generally it's going to be a frost-free night for most. Very wet, windy day, certainly morning for Saturday, Northern Ireland, England and Wales. The rain becomes confined to central southern Scotland. To the north of it, brighter, sunshine, a few showers, and it brightens up later in the day across England and Wales. Sunny spells, a few scattered showers, and very mild, 14 degrees in the southeast, but the winds will become a feature later in the day on Saturday. Widespread gales, Northern Ireland, England and Wales. And then there's a risk of gusts of 60 to 70 miles an hour, Northern Ireland, particularly so into northwest England and North Wales. This could cause some disruption for a time through Saturday evening, the first part of the night. As we move through Saturday night, the winds remain strong but ease down somewhat. It stays quite showery across Scotland, but we'll see a slot of drier, clearer weather for England, Wales, Northern Ireland for a time on Sunday morning, and again largely frost-free. Sunday starts off fine, some early sunshine, central eastern areas, but it won't be long till the next low pressure system moves through to bring wetter and breezier weather. The rain becomes confined to northern and eastern areas, and again we should see a bit of sunshine into the afternoon for England and Wales, where we'll see temperatures 10 to 12 degrees here. It stays unsettled into the start of the new week on the mild side, but then there's hints of it turning drier as high pressure builds in for the end of the week with increasing amounts of sunshine. Take care.
Margaret Atwood, welcome to This Cultural Life. Some of the world's leading artistic figures revealed to me their influences.
Music is part of our culture, dance is part of our culture.
And the experiences that have inspired their own work.
The people around me never said you can't do this.
I was totally in love with Monk.
Now I'm blushing. Find out what fires the creative imagination with John Wilson. This Cultural Life. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
The art of good conversation is to say the right thing at the right time and in the right way. You have to be original, sympathetic, encouraging, and also keep an open mind. And you really do just need to sit back and listen.
Catty Kay chats with prominent names from the worlds of business, science, and culture.
Influential with me, Catty Kay. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
Travelling can be so much more than a holiday.
It's about diving headfirst into new experiences.
And seeing the world with fresh eyes.
Where each destination tells a unique story.
And every encounter brings a new perspective.
Because all of these amazing places
are made so much richer by the people who live in them.
So unleash your spirit of adventure.
And join us for a deeper understanding of the world.
The Travel Show. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
Hello, I'm Christian Fraser. You're watching The Context on BBC News. A landmark poll reveals overwhelming support for Joe Biden's climate agenda. The majority of US adults and half of Republicans back an ambitious emissions cut by 2030. Yeah, that might be seen as the good news for Joe Biden. This not so good. President Biden's son Hunter could go on trial twice next year while his father runs for re-election. The special counsel David Weiss filed a second indictment last night. He was charged by a grand jury with 9 counts of failing to file and pay taxes, tax evasion and filing false tax returns. 3 of those charges are felonies. Another 6 are misdemeanors. Some of those charges relate to a period when he was struggling with depression and addicted to drugs, but prosecutors allege Hunter exploited the family name to fund a lavish lifestyle, spending funds on hotels, escorts and a Porsche, and that even after he was sober and building a new life, he failed to fully pay the taxes he owed. It is the second federal indictment. He also faces charges stemming from the illegal purchase of a handgun while addicted. Republicans, of course, trying to link his behaviour to a possible impeachment against the president. So, Kelly, I'm really interested to know, as I'm sure are many of our viewers, whether an ordinary person would be indicted for similar offences, or is some of this political?
Well, according to Hunter Biden's attorney, it definitely is political. But we also have to remember in the U.S. court system, you are innocent until you are proven guilty. And just because you are indicted does not mean that you've been convicted of the crime. Indictment in the U.S. means that based on the evidence that was presented to the grand jury, they believe that serious charges should be brought. Ultimately, it'll be up to the prosecution who brings such a case in order to prove each element of the crime and see if the jury comes back with innocent or guilty.
Would Mr. Vice have been able to bring these indictments had the Attorney General not installed him as a special counsel?
I'm sorry, could you say that one more time? I didn't quite hear you.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. Would Mr. Vice be able to bring these indictments had the Attorney General not installed him as a special counsel?
That's a really good question. So a special counsel was done in order to show that there is no bias or anything like that, because there were allegations that there was some kind of bias or that nothing was brought based on the fact that he was Hunter Biden. But we have to remember that this is Hunter Biden. This is not President Biden. We have Trump, who's running for office, who has been indicted 4 times and has some serious charges against him. So we'll have to see ultimately how this plays out in a court of law. But some say that against Hunter Biden is in fact politically motivated because of who he is.
The Republicans, Kelly, have always said that Hunter Biden traded on the family name. He would never have been paid that amount of money had he not been the vice president's son at the time, which I think is fair enough when you look at his business acumen and where he was working. But then Donald Trump employed his family in the White House. There were reports his daughter went to China to secure trademarks for her beauty products. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, secured a $2 billion loan from the Saudis from a fund managed by the Crown Prince. So there's plenty when you look the other way, and I just wonder if Republicans are as interested in that.
Well, hopefully they would be, because of the fact that it's important to get to the truth and to find out that information, especially with Trump being indicted on 4 different cases and going to trial next year. Hopefully there should be such a thing. So I think that's really, really important to realize that. We also have to remember in the U.S. that a Republican was just expelled from Congress because of some serious allegations of ethical violations in what he did. So I think that's important. So hopefully the Republicans are just as interested in Hunter Biden and interested in Trump as they are interested in Hunter Biden.
Yeah, Leon, that's provided that these cases that Donald Trump's involved in go to trial next year. The latest news is that he's appealing the January 6th case in Washington under 2 counts. One being double jeopardy, that he's already been cleared in a congressional impeachment investigation, and the second being that he had immunity as a former president. The judge says, no, you don't, but if it's very likely that the Court of Appeal will certainly look at the immunity part of this. You get the sense, I mean, he is the procrastinator extraordinaire. He can put anything off, and we might not even get to a trial by the time of the election.
Absolutely, Christian. And look, I'm no legal expert, but from a political point of view, I think that Donald Trump does defy political gravity in a way that maybe Joe Biden's just certainly doesn't. And, you know, when you look at Joe Biden pitching himself as the clean candidate, the clean alternative to Donald Trump, but yet the Hunter Biden issues are overshadowing that in particular. And I do think Donald Trump is able to leverage these types of legal indictments that are coming against him. He's able to leverage this and say, look, it's the state after me, and if you don't protect me, they'll come after you next. And I think that is an incredibly compelling, if not dangerous, political message for him to be delivering. But I think we're going to hear a lot more of that as he goes through the legal process, whether or not he ends up going all the way to court or not. But either way, I can't see this harming Donald Trump necessarily. I can only see it bolstering him as he seeks re-election. So I do think that the challenges faced
I also think, Leon, that some of his supporters actually like it. I mean, I think it was on Tuesday, he was talking to Fox News and he's comparing himself to Al Capone. You wouldn't do that. I mean, there's no other candidate who would do that unless there was a sort of edge within the base that likes the fact that he plays with the establishment.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure they do. And, you know, how many political candidates can be indicted and have these legal allegations made against you and then use that as a way of fundraising by selling merchandise with your mugshot on a T-shirt or on a poster? You know, it's unbelievable that Donald Trump is able to leverage that. And I think there is a part of his base that likes the fact that he is a renegade, that likes the fact that he's a maverick not playing by the rules. And they want a politician that isn't conventional. And I think they see that in Donald Trump. And this just adds to that narrative, fueling his appeal against some certain bases of the Republican Party.
Yeah, plenty of court cases coming up. Listen, since Leon talked about the clean alternative, let's talk about climate, because the head of OPEC has urged members of the oil cartel to reject any deal at the UN climate talks in Dubai this weekend that targets fossil fuels instead of emissions. In a letter sent to his members, the OPEC Secretary General, Haytham Al-Ghais, said he was writing with a sense of utmost urgency following the publication of a draft deal at COP28 that includes language on phasing out fossil fuels. It seems that the undue and disproportionate pressure against fossil fuels may reach a tipping point, he said, with irreversible consequences, because this draft decision still contains options on phasing fuels out. COP28 is into its last few days. The summit president, Sultan Al Jaber, who is CEO of the UAE state oil company ADNOC, has told countries that he thinks a potentially historic deal is in reach. But there are many parties at the conference who have shared their concerns, not least because of who he is and whether the commitments that are being made will be enforced. 2023 certain to be the warmest year to date, largely because of record carbon emissions, but also due to the rising impact of the El Niño weather phenomenon. On this, the 9th day of the summit, here's our correspondent Carl Nassman.
Week 2 kicking off here in Dubai after a very eventful week 1. In fact, according to one tally, $57 billion of pledges were made over those first few days. But in talking with the actual negotiators, what they're telling us is that there's still a lot of work that needs to get done. There's many details that have not been agreed upon, including the all-important global stock take. Now, this is like a climate report card examining the progress of each nation's emissions cuts and then beginning to assign newer, more aggressive ones. That has not yet been agreed upon yet. There's also another deal on adaptation that is still not finished. So those negotiators will be putting in long days and nights in some of the rooms to my right. Now, we did hear some positive comments from COP28 President Sultan Al Jaber earlier, saying he thinks that we could see a meaningful deal. But one of the biggest sticking points of all is over the language of a phase out of fossil fuels or a phase down. There are 106 nations who want that phase out, but as we know, it only takes one country to block an entire deal.
Wow. OK, well, earlier this week, Donald Trump was asked whether he was likely to rule as a dictator if he returned to the White House. This is the answer he gave.
Except for day one.
Except
Look,
what?
he's going crazy. Except for day one.
Meaning?
I want to close the border and I want to drill.
That's
drill,
not. That's
drill.
That's not.
No, no.
That's not retribution.
I'm going to be. You know, he keeps. We love this guy. He says, "You're not going to be a dictator, are you?" I said, "No, no, no. Other than day one, we're closing the border and we're drilling, drilling, drilling. After that, I'm not a dictator."
As if America's not already drilling. Saudi Arabia is making cuts. American production is now at 13.2 million barrels a day. That's an all-time high. And yet look at the polling published today by SSRS in conjunction with CNN. Nearly 2/3 of US adults say they're worried about the threat of climate change. 2/3 of them, more than half, are worried about the impact of extreme weather. And a broad majority of US adults, 73%, say the federal government should be developing climate policy with the goal of cutting emissions in half by the end of the decade, by 2030. And the really interesting stuff about this poll, Kelly, which caught my eye, is that actually it's a majority, almost a majority, half of Republicans. I mean, on some of those graphs, it's more than half. They think that greenhouse gases should be cut by 2030, 73% altogether. Is that the sort of poll that moves political decisions?
Absolutely. I think it's really interesting. We have to remember that Trump has said climate change is a hoax. But according to that poll, a majority of Americans support some type of fixing of our climate issue. This is for our future generations. Not only does it affect the U.S., but it affects our allies. It affects all of us. We are all in this together. And that is definitely a key. And Biden has stated that he wants to make changes in order to help our environment. And that's what he's been doing and will continue to do. We have to remember,
Yeah, I mean, do you remember, Leon, the Australian election recently and the victory of the Teals, who unseated, I think, 6 Conservatives, Teal being, of course, green and blue. So these were guys that would normally have voted on a Conservative tilt, but they were voting solely on the issue of climate, and it cost the Conservatives the government. They lost their majority. I just wonder, I mean, what would it be? It'd be red and green. There'd be browns in America. But I wonder if browns might one day start costing the Republicans a majority.
It may well do. I think it may well do. But the question that was asked, Christian, was, are you concerned about climate change broadly? And I think most people would be. But the more important question is, would you be willing to pay more in taxes or pay more in the cost of goods and services as a way of combating climate change? And I think that's one of the big problems that we've certainly got on this side of the Atlantic. During a cost of living crisis, during a time when inflation is rising, people are looking at green initiatives and saying, well, yeah, I do support combating climate change, but I also need to make ends meet, and I can't do that at any cost. So I do think there is more nuance to this particular question, but there is certainly, I think, from politicians on both sides of the Atlantic, a desire to make sure that they are showing voters that we are interested in climate change and we are wanting to do something about it.
Yeah, well, it's positive news, I think, that in a country that obviously uses the car, attitudes are shifting, and quite considerably so. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News.
Bringing you different stories from across the UK.
You should arrive at the castle between the hours of 9:45 and 10:15.
84-year-old Cynthia has been chosen to receive an MBE for a lifetime of helping others.
I feel humbled, to be honest. I feel, do I deserve it? There surely are other people that have worked perhaps longer than I have.
Cynthia grew up in South Yorkshire. Her dad was a coal miner and she was always taught a strong work ethic.
My dad would have been absolutely amazed. He really would. And it's caused quite a stir. Thank you. Thank you.
And no more so than at the village hall, which she saved from ruin.
She just never stops. She's $1 million, and I'm proud that she calls me friend.
Absolute legend in the area. Everybody knows Cynthia.
Cynthia's diary is as busy as ever, but she has made room to meet the King.
For more stories from across the UK, head to the BBC News website.
You're watching BBC News. Now it is time for the panel. Part of the show where we give it over to the panel to choose their stories. I'll start with you, Leon, tonight. The moment last night, let me talk into it, you can explain it. The moment last night that Rishi Sunak met Mark Rutte, the Netherlands Prime Minister, on the steps of Downing Street, and this happened.
Yeah. The handshake's very obligatory. And then they try to get through the door and it's not opening. And they have a little look round.
Is there a secret key here anywhere?
Have a little look round and finally get let in. It's quite excruciating to watch, isn't it, Christian?
a man has to take the hint, right? That's not for me to say. That's probably Suella Braverman. But why did that happen? Give me the lowdown, because you've walked through that door many times. How does it work?
So there is no doorknob. You can't actually open it from outside. It can only be opened from within. And there tends to be a policeman or security guard on the other side of the door watching the security cameras to see that whether it's the Prime Minister or a dignitary or Larry the cat. And when they are at the door, it is meant to open up and let them in. And usually they are very eagle-eyed, these security guards, because it can lead to some political embarrassment if, as happens here, they start having a wander round looking at Christmas trees and whatever else is happening before they realise that actually the Prime Minister and the Dutch Prime Minister need to be let in. It's quite chilly in December in London. So I think it was slightly embarrassing. And as a PR guy, that's not the type of optics that you want to see for a Prime Minister or any politician.
No. What is the Dutch for? Did you bring a key? I don't know. It's a great story. It did make me laugh, that. Well done, you. Kelly, you want to talk about P. Diddy, who is facing new charges.
Yes. So in the U.S., you are innocent till proven guilty, but there has been a ex-girlfriend of his that filed a lawsuit against him, making some serious allegations, but that case has settled. But now another lawsuit has come out against him by another woman, a Jane Doe, about some serious allegations. P. Diddy denies all the allegations, and as I stated, in the U.S., you are innocent till proven guilty, but this absolutely does have some kind of effect on his reputation and ideas in the media.
How many times do we see this? We've seen it with Russell Brand on this side of the pond, Kelly, where an allegation is made, it's forcefully denied, and then very quickly others come forward.
Yes, that could, potentially happen as well. But as I said before, in the U.S., you are innocent till proven guilty. And just because someone makes an allegation doesn't mean it's true. But when the fact you have multiple allegations, those are some serious things. Yeah. However, Trump had multiple women coming forward about him, and that didn't seem to have any effect on him.
Really good. Love your stories. Thank you very much for coming on the programme tonight. It's been great having your company. Thank you to Leon and Kelly. We will be back, of course,